I would imagine that many of you back in the day in high school were asked or forced, depending on your opinion, to read A Tale of Two Cities. You may not remember any of it, but if I start the first line, you'll be like, oh yeah, it's that one, right? Everybody knows it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, and then it goes on from there. It's a famous introduction, but it's also kind of a head scratcher. How can it be the best of times and the worst of times at the same time? And of course, the book goes on to show you that there's some good stuff and there's some horrible stuff going on here in these people's lives. Because, as is the case in life, good is often alongside the bad. It can be difficult to separate them. Every system, every organization, every group is flawed because the people who inhabit it, the people that make it up, that run it, that make it exist, are themselves flawed, and the institution reflects them. The church is no different. Now, the power of God and the Spirit of God working within the people of God tilts the balance toward good in the church, but the bad remains to be reckoned with. Think about that thought as we take a look at two episodes in the Gospel of Mark here in chapter 12 that are linked by Mark by being put together, and I see a common thread in them as well. So let's take a look starting at verse 38. It says, "As he taught, Jesus said, 'Watch out for the teachers of the law.'" The teachers of the law or Moses are supposed to be the good guys, aren't they? And that's their job, right? To teach the people what God requires of them, expects of them, what is right, what is wrong, etc. You shouldn't have to look out for them. You should be listening to them. You should be following their instruction. But like the Pharisees, we've got something wrong here. Now, some of them must have been genuine in their faith and in their service. They couldn't all have been rotten. But Jesus found too many of these teachers of the law in his day in that place to be otherwise. Too many of them were a negative influence, were a drag or a weight on the people that they're supposed to be ministering to, rather than being life preservers. Now, that this is the way that it still is and has always been, that it is always potentially true of that about those who serve as pastors or priests or other roles within the church, is both a sobering reminder of how dark the human heart apart from God can be, but also an ongoing call to all of us to live by grace and faith. If those called to serve can be a threat, that reminds us that all of us need to be awake to what could be happening in our hearts and minds. That such a warning is necessary to their generation and to ours is sad, but it's also true. Why is he warning them to watch out for the teachers of the law? They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. The particular fault of the religious leaders in Jesus' day that begins this discussion is vanity. It's a commonplace enough sin. It affects many people who mistake their talent, their position, their accolades, or their titles as their own doing, and neglect to deflect the honor that God, who is the author of all things, deserves. Vanity is a subject of the much larger, a subset of the much larger human frailty of pride. As big a stumbling block between man and a right relationship with God as there is. Very serious problem. So how did they indulge their vanity? They did so by treating their role as God's representatives as a path to personal aggrandizement. In other words, speaking for God worked out real well for them, and they appreciated that. Their practice of religion benefited them with a series of perks and privileges, like being some kind of aristocrat, or in our day and age, somebody famous. If you're famous, you get all sorts of perks in society, right? Of course, there are some downsides, the paparazzi and whatnot. We don't like to think about that. But there are all sorts of perks, and they were reveling in the perks, in their fancy robes, in their special seats, in their places of honor. The hearts of the men who occupied them did so with greed, not with humility. We don't want to get sidetracked by anti-clericalism. If you know the story of the French Revolution, you know that after the French Revolution, there was a wave of anti-clericalism in France, where they basically tore down all sorts of privileges and institutions because there was so much anger towards the church. It wasn't the fact that they wore robes that made this happen, or that they had their own seat at the synagogue, nor even the fact that they were honored from time to time. It was their hearts. Jesus isn't against the idea of honoring those who have earned honors. He himself accepted honors when it was according with God's will, and believe me, at the end of time, he will. Philippians 2 makes that quite clear, that every knee will bow before Jesus. So it's not the idea of honor that is the problem here. The problem is the fact that their hearts are rotten. The problem is that we in Christianity, as in Judaism before us, are supposed to be sending glory on to God and not keeping it for ourselves. When we receive praise for our talents, for our accomplishments, for the things which we can do or have done, it is incumbent upon us to reflect that upward. Not let it linger and appreciate it for ourselves. So attitude matters. The same action done by a humble person can be righteous, but when done by a person full of pride can be immoral. Not easy to tell from the outside looking in, but of course God knows the heart. They did that. They also did something that went beyond just vanity and pride. Jesus said they devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely. Those are not related things, but they are two things of the same coin. The donations of widows were a prime source of income in first century Judaism for these men. A lot of them were supported by the bequeathments of a widow. To accept that donation, that gift, was not immoral, and Jesus wasn't condemning that, but to seek them out like a ravenous wolf looking for opportunity, right? You do the funeral, and then you're talking to the widow about a donation. They were laser focused on getting this money for themselves. Serving God should not be a path to anything other than a middle-class lifestyle. I'm quite serious about this. Now, I know that every once in a while, someone going into the ministry, serving as a minister or a missionary or some such, will have inherited family wealth, right? Maybe their brother is rich and they've got some of that money. Aside from that, the actual remuneration and payment for services rendered and whatnot should not make you rich. There's no good reason to be a rich minister. There just isn't. There should not be luxury cars, yachts, jets, mansions, and whatnot. Contrary to popular belief, all of those are signs that God's favor is missing from that person's life and ministry, not present. Something is terribly amiss in that situation. Those in this line of work, trying to serve the church, who are there for the money, should get out. Or they should be thrown out. The people in those ministries that are supposed to be responsible should have taken care of that a long time ago, but they don't, or they haven't. But we know that. We can see that. It's obvious to everyone, especially the world around us. What about the lengthy prayers? What on earth is he talking about there? Lengthy prayers here that Jesus is upset with are about fakery. Long prayers are not more or less holy than short ones. You know that, right? A short prayer and a long prayer can be equally holy. But if you're putting on a performance for the audience, if it's not about talking to God, it's about performing for the audience, then at least in their culture, a long one was going to get you more cheers. People were going to walk away saying, "Did you hear that prayer? That guy's awesome." And so they prayed that way. But worship is not play acting. Now, you may not feel 100% involved every time. You may come to church from time to time, and we're singing the songs, and you're singing along, and your head's not in it. You're worried about work, or your health, or your family, or something. Or maybe your heart's just not in it. You're angry, you're disappointed, something like that. I know that happens from time to time. That's being human. We all struggle to focus on what is necessary at times. We all struggle to focus. But to go into worship or prayer, purposefully acting with deep emotion and fervency, when you don't actually feel it, in order to be seen by other people doing that, is a grave insult to God. We are supposed to be in a relationship with God, are we not? Those who take God seriously would not expect him to tolerate being used as a prop. As much as it sickens us to witness charlatans when they amass a huge audience and a vast fortune and even a global fame, know this: God will not be mocked. You do not want to be that person on the day of judgment who used the church to get rich, who used the church to puff up their pride. You don't want to be that person on the day of judgment, because it will not be pretty. So there's one episode. And frankly, that is the dark underside of religion, of the church, of ministers. The kind of thing that turns people off, pushes people away, makes people think that this whole thing is a racket. And frankly, it's real. It doesn't do us any good as a church to pretend that's not happening. You know why? Because the people out there that don't go to church, the people who aren't saved, that aren't part of the faith, they know it's real. Us pretending it's not real and it's not a problem, that's not going to fool them. They know it's real. They can turn on the TV and see. They can go on YouTube and watch. They know they're real. So there's the dark side. But there is light too. Let's take a look at that. This is an interesting episode. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. This actually reminded me of something this day. My wife's grandmother, Eleanor, beautiful woman, died a few years ago. She used to go to the mall, back when people actually went to the mall. I know this is blowing your mind, young people, but people actually used to go to the mall because there were stores in it. She used to go to the mall and sit and people watch. She would sit down and just watch the people go by and be entertained by that. Not my cup of tea, but she found it fascinating. What were they wearing? What was going on with them? She just enjoyed it. Just sitting there watching people go by. Well, Jesus is going to people watch. but with the intent of showing his disciples something. He's looking for something that he can teach his disciples, and he knows if he watches for a while, he'll see it. This location where the money is being put in is in the court of women, the outer court, one of the outer courts of the temple. There are 13 trumpet-shaped collection boxes, like the one in this picture here, where people drop their money in. Now, me personally, I make it a policy not to watch people giving donations to the church. Back before COVID, when we passed the offering plates up, and now when they're sitting back there, I purposely don't watch. I don't want to know. I don't want to know who in this congregation gives 10% of their income, who gives more, who gives less, and who gives none. Why don't I want to know? Very simple reason. That knowledge could negatively affect how I shepherd the flock. The last thing that I need is to be, or seem to be, more responsive to the needs of a big donor and less responsive to the needs of a non-donor. It's easier for me just not to know, frankly. Well, Jesus is not corruptible. He has no such worries. So he can watch and wait and look for a lesson. Well, first off, he saw this. Many rich people threw in large amounts. But a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Well, so the rich people put in a lot of money. Good for them. They were blessed with resources, and they gave back at least some of what they were given for the ministry of the Lord. Jesus in particular, and the Bible in general, has a lot to say about wealth. This is one of the prime topics of the Bible, is money and what we do with it, especially with wealth. But Jesus isn't going to say anything about it today. That's not what he was looking for. To find something positive to contrast with the teachers of the law, we need to keep watching. And here it is. This poor widow puts in these 2 small copper coins. They're actually called lepta. Each of them is worth 1/64. That's an odd fraction, but 1/64 of a laborer's daily wage, of the denarius. You remember the parable of the workers, right? They come in the morning, they come at noon, they come at evening, and they each receive a denarius. This coin is worth 1/64 of that, and she put in 2. So 1/32, right? You didn't know you're going to have to do fraction math this morning. I'm sorry, I did it for you. You just have to listen. That's how much she put in. Mark illustrates it for his Gentile readers by actually putting in a Latin word here, a quadrantes. It's the Latin coin that's equivalent to this one from the Near East. So if a day laborer's daily wage, just round numbers to be easier, was $100, each of the coins would be $1.56. Now, typically a day laborer, right, a daily laborer, not someone with a trade, but someone who's just working for the day, is going to make less than that. So we can assume that our equivalent economically of what she was able to put into the temple treasury was worth less than the price of a gallon of milk. $2, $2.50, $2.75, $3, something like that. That's what she had. And that was all that she had. So how then is this moment going to offer us an example of religion at its best? And no, it's not because she gave all her money. It has nothing to do with it. Let's look and see. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put it more into the treasury than all the others." The answer is going to be about perspective. At its best, religion adapts our perspective. It changes our attitude away from self-centered views. That's what the teachers of the law had, right? What is in it for me? How can this benefit me? When faith is working, it turns that away from thinking about you toward the selfless view of this widow. In other words, true religion, as James told us in our reading this morning, allows us to see with more than eyes, to look beyond today to eternity, to invest in, to sacrifice for the plans and purposes that are beyond ourselves, ones that serve a higher purpose. Now you might be thinking, that's an awful lot to take away from a woman putting a couple of small copper coins into the treasury. You sure that's all there? Yeah, because Jesus sees that. He says she put in more. Now, math is a helpful thing. Whether you ever liked math or not, it can be very helpful because math doesn't care about your motives, right? 2 plus 2 is going to equal 4, whether that answer helps you or hurts you. It's just what it is. The only way that this woman can be credited with giving more than the rich people is if Jesus is doing some of that higher math. Any of you love the higher math? When we leave numbers behind and we're starting using letters and all that, right? When your 7th grader brings the math homework home and you go, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. Actually, these days it might be 4th grade. They keep lowering where the algebra starts. This is not just a greater than, less than, or equal to problem. Jesus is doing something here out of the ordinary. Look at his explanation. They all gave out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in everything, all she had to live on. She gave more as a percentage. A poor person who gives $2 to a worthy cause, when that's all they have, is giving more of themselves than a rich person who donates $2 million if they have $100 million. Now, from the charity's point of view, that $2 million is going to fund a lot more programs and feed a lot more people or whatever. But in the eyes of God, where the motivation of the heart is front and center, she gave more, they gave less. Now, why did she do it? Seems like a foolish choice for someone who needs the money, right? She needs the money. This is all she's got. When we help local people pay their rent or utilities through the Central Help Fund, those of you who are not aware, the Central Help Fund, we got about 18 churches in the greater Franklin area that contribute so that we can together help people with rent and utilities. A large percentage of the people that have sat in front of me at my desk as we talk about whether or not we can help them have said, "I'll pay you back soon." A lot of them have. And I always tell them, if you want to pay it forward, if you want to give to a good cause, if you want to help someone else in need, that's fine. But from the church's point of view, we are not looking for repayment. This is charity. This is to help you. I'm not keeping track. I don't know if you ever give it back to anyone. I don't want to know. I want you to be helped and to not have that as a burden on your shoulders. And many of the people that we help, actually probably more than half, are living on just SSI, Social Security Disability. They get something a little bit less than about $800 a month to live on. That's rent, food, utilities, everything. $800. It's not a lot. Churches and charities accept donations from poor people if they're given. We do. We don't ask how much you have when you give something. That's not the way it works. But they're not the ones we're focusing on. We're not making appeals to try to get the people at the bottom of the economic scale to give more money. Many of us have been there at one point in our lives. Nicole and I were there for a while. A lot longer while than we wanted to be. Looking at the checkbook month to month, wondering how on earth are we going to pay the gas bill? How are we going to pay for that car repair? It's hard. It's frustrating. It's emotionally exhausting to be that person. We know this. So why is she doing it? Well, Mark doesn't tell us. He doesn't tell us anything about her, actually. What was she thinking? What was she hoping? What was her past? What's her future? We don't know any of that. The only thing we know is that she's a widow. That's a vulnerable group, culturally and economically speaking, in the ancient Near East. Few groups were as vulnerable as widows and orphans, which is why, of course, our text this morning told us that God cares about caring about widows and orphans. They were the most vulnerable. She doesn't have any expectation of getting more money, by the way. There is no social safety net in her generation, in her culture, in her time. She may not have any money coming. No real hope for the future. So it seems that this woman is as shipwrecked financially as anybody you could know. She is a long way from shore, floating in the ocean. And she decided to let go of that one small piece of wood she'd been hanging on to. Barely enough to keep her above water, just a couple of bucks, and she says, forget it, I'll let it go. Now that may be irrational. It may seem foolish to us to do that. But for her, it was an act of faith in God. Like Elijah asking for food from a widow whose cupboard contains enough in it for one meal for her and her son. And she says, after this, we're going to starve to death. And Elijah says, make me lunch first. Now, you or I may not be called to trust God totally like that in our day-to-day circumstances. We may not be called to walk that tightrope without a net. But if we are, that's the kind of faith we're going to need. Like Indiana Jones taking the leap of faith from the unseen bridge in The Last Crusade, right? He's just got to put one foot forward and see what happens. And then the camera turns and you go, oh, it was there the whole time. I don't know how they did that, actually. It's quite fascinating. That's a great special effect. Sometimes faith requires going all in on trusting God. You see, at its best, religion, and by that I mean Christianity, because Christianity is the only option that's actually going to be able to do this, allows us to set aside me, myself, and I to be part of something that God is doing in our midst. Whether or not God puts before you a situation of total trust in the physical realm, whether it's your life, your health, your safety, or some such thing, whether or not God puts you in that position that she was in, each of us do need to live by faith, because it's the only way to please God. And it's the only path forward to cross over from life to death to eternal life on the other side. It's the only way across the river. Only faith. So let's get back to one of our earlier thoughts. Why are some elevated by their involvement with the church, and others seem little changed, or even find it to be a good place for them to indulge their immorality? In our readings today, Jesus highlighted both what religion and faith is capable of, selfless dependence on God, and what it can be abused to produce, self-aggrandizement, especially among those who lead. This is reality. This is a consistent issue confronting Israel of old and the church throughout its history, today included. But why? Well, the short answer is free will in the human heart. Slightly longer answer, God has given us the gift of choice, and we can use that choice for good or evil. Humanity's evil necessitated that God redeem us and save us from our own choices. Now, some people will latch onto that hope. They will repent, they will be transformed, and they will be saved. A minority will take advantage of the mercy of God, will utilize those redemptive structures, in other words, the church and Christian charities, for their own immoral purposes. And they will spit in the face of God to feed their own pride and lust and greed. Interestingly, there's a third group of people, and we all have seen them, and maybe we were them at some point. For now, they appear to be observers. They're maybe too defensive to change much as yet. But they're not really trying to take advantage of God. They're not trying to take advantage of the people of God either. They're just kind of hanging out with us. And by the way, people can change what group they belong in. You can find yourself in the taking advantage of God group if you go down the wrong path. Or you can go from the observing group to the believing group. That's for darn sure. For better or for worse, our task is to protect against the charlatans. We need to do that. We need to keep our eyes and our ears and our hearts open for those that would take advantage of the trusting nature of the love, of the kindness of the church, especially in leadership. We need to nudge the undecided. We need to help give them a gentle nudge, not a shove, a gentle nudge, an encouragement to say, come, join us. And we absolutely need to sustain and be with and help and fellowship with those who have already taken that leap of faith. 3 things I want us to think on as we walk away from this message. Number 1, the purpose of faith is not to puff you up. If that's what you're getting out of it, you're getting out of it the wrong thing. It's not what it's for. It's never been. Secondly, radical trust in God is a powerful thing. It is an amazing thing when you see it and when you live it. And lastly, we need to be honest and know that the church is capable of both of being abused by the unscrupulous, occupied by the indifferent, and empowered by the faithful.